programming, Princeton, for Brooke's talk. So I want to se va a proyectar también en las pantallas, de modo que... Okay, good, very well. So thank you very much for giving a talk at this conference. So Brooke Holmes studied relativity, ontological holism, and the rise of sympathy.
Okay, so does everybody have the new handout, the more elaborated handout?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, and it's on the screen as well. So I'm going to work through the paper that I sent around with an outline that has the passages from the paper and also some other new material. I'm going to try to work through the time that I have, and I think I'll be okay. I'm just going to say, so I don't want to say too much about the larger context of this paper, but I think it's worth saying, as I said in conversation with some of you, that this is part of a larger project on Sympatheia that looks at the entire conceptual domain from the 4th century BCE to the 3rd century CE. And one of the claims that I make in the book is that Sympatheia helps us see how the problem of what I call embodied relation emerges within what's called from, the Phaedo registers, this the inquiry into nature, so the part, so hysteria. And part of the argument is that if you think about a physis, it's not, it doesn't actually have a relative determination. And so part of the story about how sympathy emerges is how bodies start to relate to one another, not just as bodies, but as participants in a larger whole. And so I can say more about that, but I want to just give you that background, this problem of embodied relation, because working on this paper has, I think, helped me clarify how this problem might become elevated and developed in the Stoics. So the Stoics are going to be an important part of any story about sympathy. This helps us understand how they might become important. So I went about writing this starting from Matt Duncombe's really helpful recent work on relativity that, of course, builds on other work that kind of starts with this distinction that we get in Simplicius between two different kinds of relativity that the Stoics engage with. And I think Matt makes a good case that there's a genus here of the prosty, of which these two kinds of relativity are two species. One is the prosty, where it seems to be the relative is determined by an intrinsic character as well as an extrinsic relation with another body. And the second kind of relativity, the relatively disposed, the object, I'm going to use that terminology, is constituted exclusively by its relation to something else. We were just talking about this, so I'm not going to go into too much detail. I'll just pick out or underscore the point that we were talking about in relation to Matt's paper, that he reads these objects, he reads the relatives in both of these cases as objects that are constituted by the relation. And I think that's right. Now, the next point that I want to make that sort of looks at where I'm going with this in the paper is that most of the discussion of relatives has unfolded within the domain of a definitional context, a semantic context, logical, metaphysical, and there's been less attention to its role in a cosmological context or in the context of ontological holism, although people will often note that there is a clear application of the principle to the cosmological context, and that is T2 on your handout, which is from Plutarch, and he's discussing Chrysippus's account of the natural motion of all bodies in his book on motion. And so he says, Chrysippus says that cosmos is a complete body, teleon soma, but the parts of the cosmos are not complete because they are disposed in certain ways relative to the whole and are not per se. So this clearly looks like it corresponds to other kinds of objects that are constituted by being relatively disposed to another object in the scheme that Duncombe lays out. But there also seems to be some differences. So, for example, the being relatively disposed isn't going to differentiate objects from one another, as it's only going to differentiate them as parts relative to a whole. So it can't do any definitional work. It wouldn't do epistemic work. So it seems to be maybe having another function. And the other point that I just wanted to raise is that the part-whole relation isn't going to be symmetrical. So the parts, this is exactly the point that Chrysippus makes, the parts are relatively disposed to the whole is in itself absolute. When we get into the differentiated relatives and what those might mean at the cosmological level, there's actually more symmetry. But really the point I want to make here at the introduction is to say, so mereology looks like it's related to relativity. So these two things sort of go together, but we can't only put mereology or what's happening at the cosmological level, I'll say more broadly, under the broader category of relativity. There are some special features of relatives when they're operating at the level of ontological holism that invite us to think about them on their own terms, and how maybe this distinction between relatives might cash out at the cosmological or the ontological level. So my question is, we have this piece of evidence that shows us how the category, the idea of being relatively disposed, was used by Chrysippus at the level of ontological holism. Is there another way or a place where we might think about the differentiated relatives? I'm going to put that in scare quotes, but just so we can keep track of them, how they might work at the level of cosmology or ontological holism. The proposal that I'm going to defend in the paper is that the best place to look at this is going to be in the evidence for sympathy or sympatheia, that begins with Chrysippus, where sympatheia looks like it's a condition of, or dynamic condition of unified bodies, including the cosmos, that suggests that parts are constituted as parts through their capacity to act in relation to the other parts and to the unified whole. So under these conditions, parts are going to be constituted through this capacity to act in relation, which is in some kind of working relationship with them being constituted as relatively disposed to the whole, but is also different from it. So two kinds of axes of difference. One, we want to think about the definitional scope of relatives in relationship to ontological holism, and then we want to think about how the different kinds of relativity might work once we get to the level of ontological holism. Okay, so that's the general aim. So in the first section, I try to start to see how we can work from the distinction that Duncombe is drawing between different kinds of relativity into the space that that distinction might apply at the level of ontological holism. So in the paper, I try to follow the distinction between these two kinds of relatives in the way that Duncombe maps them on to corporeals or bodies and incorporeals. So we were just talking about this in the first category, let's call it differentiated relatives. Objects are going to be constituted as bodies with a capacity to act in relation to other bodies. In the second category, objects that are relatively disposed, they're only going to be constituted through their relation to others. So Duncombe argues that makes them abstract objects. So I was trying to work with a distinction between corporeals and incorporeals that I would then try to work out at the ontological level. I'm not 100, this is something I'm sort of working out. I think that it might be more useful to think about the application of these two kinds of relatives at the ontological level or the cosmological level in terms of thinking about relativity rather in terms of metaphysics, which is where the idea of the relatively disposed as a way of thinking about parts and wholes would come into play. And on the other hand, thinking about them in terms of physics, where the parts of the whole, the parts of the cosmos, are now constituted as bodies with a capacity to act, but always in relationship to other parts and to the whole. So as we saw from the discussion, how these distinctions, corporeal and incorporeal, physics, metaphysics might work together is something, you know, I certainly haven't fully worked out. But what I want to say is I think for my purposes, it's most useful to think about these two kinds of relatives at the level of ontological holism in terms of metaphysics and physics, describing parts in relationship to the wholes. So We've seen again that there's a cosmological context to thinking about parts as relatively disposed. Let's start to think about how parts might be relative to a whole if we think about them as bodies with a capacity to act or be acted upon. Now, I want to get into this by saying that Duncombe himself makes an argument for thinking about the larger implications of his theory of differentiated relatives for physics operative at the level of cosmology or ontology. So the argument that he makes is that, in fact, once we have the idea of differentiated relatives, it has very clear implications for the Stoic theory of active and passive principle. More specifically, it allows us to think about those two bodies as differentiated relatives. Now, if we think about them, this is his argument, as differentiated relatives, it will allow us to avoid an unwelcome outcome, which is identified by Alexander in his critique of Stoic theory of mixture. So I want to look at this critique to see how then for Duncombe, thinking about these active and passive principles as differentiated relatives can get you out of this. So in Alexander's critique of Chrysippus's theory of mixture, he says that it would necessarily lead to the outcome of God being acted on and matter acting in turn. And the way that he advances this argument is to say, in total blending, each partner counteracts or antipaskein on the other, is acted upon by the other. And I'm sorry, I didn't put this passage on the handout, but you can see the argument. And Alexander actually gives support for this position, saying that it's only by exercising the capacity to act that each ingredient of the blend would avoid collapsing into the other ingredient. So Alexander posits as a premise here that in a mixture, every ingredient or both ingredients have to both act and be acted upon. And he describes this as antipaskein. Second, he identifies God passing through matter as a case of blending. And then he concludes that therefore God acts, but is also acted on by matter and vice versa. And this can't happen. The active principle can't be constituted in any, or can't be acted on by any way, and matter can't act. And so the way that Duncombe approaches the Alexander's critique is to say the Stoics actually can reject A. So they don't have to say that the active and the passive principles are in relation to one another as interacting bodies. Rather, if they think about them in terms of differentiated relatives, then each will constitute the other through their paired capacities. So the active will constitute the passive, where the active is the capacity to act, the passive the capacity to be acted on, and that constitution of one another is sufficient. You don't actually have to have the interaction of both. And so for him, this would solve the problem that Alexander lays out, and it would also help us understand one of the motivations at the big level, the ontological level, for a Stoic account of differentiated relatives. Now, this seems basically right. So this claim, the first premise in the argument that in total blending, each partner acts on the other, looks like Alexander's own premise that he introduces. I don't want to get into this now because for reasons of time, but I do want to flag, and I was just thinking about this, and I think it might solve some other issues. But so in a 2018 article, Halle argues that in fact all mixtures have their ingredients are related to one another through a kind of mutual interaction, and he's reading this from Hierocles' Elements of Ethics. So on Halle's reading, this would actually suggest there is Stoic evidence for this first premise of Alexander's argument. I think this can't be right. I think that the problem with Halle's analysis is that it assumes that all mixtures will have a form of interaction that I think is true only of things that are mixtures and also unified bodies. And that we can't extrapolate from Hierocles' idea of interaction onto all mixtures. So I'm not going to get into that because I haven't laid it out in the paper, but it is interesting and relevant and something we can come back to, whether or not we have to reject A as a premise foreign to the Stoics themselves. So let's just keep it for now. The second premise doesn't look just plausibly Stoic, but obviously so. So everybody, I think, would seem to think that God passing through matter is a case of blending. That seems to be, some people would think that explaining how God passes through matter is motivation for the theory of blending of process. And so from that perspective, Alexander would merely be restating this basic Stoic premise in order, in the argument, to implicate the relation between God passing through matter in the first premise, that would entail then mutual interaction between the two. And therefore, because God and matter are in a blend, each is acting on the other, and then we end up with the unwelcome premise. Okay, so I lay that out because I don't want to dispute the account that Duncombe gives about how differentiated relatives might play out in the relation between the active and passive principle. Sounds fine. But I think we can press actually further on this problem of interaction to see how we might arrive at a way of thinking about differentiated relatives that goes beyond just the relation between the active and passive principle and takes us into the the relation between parts and the unity that they're a part of, the cosmological level. And so I want to stop and not conflate the doctrine of body passing through body with total blending so quickly, in order to really think about how Alexander himself suggests the Stoics introduce the idea of body passing through body. Because why would we want to do this? If we start with the bigger problem of body passing through body and make mixture subordinate to that, then all of a sudden we have a problem, or a proposition, I should say, where in fact we have very good evidence that's attributed to Chrysippus by Alexander himself that there is a condition of mutual interaction that occurs when body passes through, where God passes through matter. And they call that condition not antipatheia. They don't describe it as antipatheia, but they describe it as being sympathetic, or sympathetic with itself. So that would suggest we can actually look to sympathy to think about this idea of differentiated relatives as it plays out in the part-whole relationship in the cosmos. So in order to sort of, before I get into some of thinking about the evidence for sympathy, I just want to go through some of the evidence in Alexander to support the claim that I just made, that that the really important problem that the Stoics seem to put forward is body passing through body, and how in that case we have a corporeal principle of unification. That's the main thing that they seem to be interested in, the theory of mixture subordinated to that. So if you look at T3, in this passage, this is the beginning of chapter 3 in Alexander's treatise. And what he's doing is he's now going to introduce Chrysippus's theory of blending, and he's going to do it in two parts. So what I've given you as T3 is the men clause of a mende clause. And he lays it out. He says, first a claim, Chrysippus has the following theory of blending. He first assumes that the whole of substance is unified by a breath that pervades it all, and by which the all is sustained and stabilized and made sympathetic with itself, sympathos with itself. Just a small note, I think Topon here can't be right. That would mean that they were thinking of the cosmos plus void, and Alexander must be confusing Topon and Tolholon, and many long and subtly would translate this as cosmos. So I think we should see this as the cosmos is sympathetic with itself, would be Chrysippus's position. So this is laid out as the first part, or the broader context of Chrysippus's account that Alexander's interested in. And the de clause goes on then to say, among the bodies within the cosmos, there are three kinds of mixture. And he lays out juxtaposition, fusion, and then introduces crossus. So crossus is one kind of mixture in these microcosmic bodies. It does not say that God passing through matter is the primary site for thinking about mixture. Okay, if we look at my T3b, you can again see how this question of body passing through body, God passing through matter, is addressed to the problem of how a body is unified by another body as the primary thing the Stoics are interested in. I realize I'm not going. Yeah, sorry. So T3b has Alexander repeat almost verbatim T3. And then he's now going to lodge an objection against this claim as a claim about a principle of unity within the cosmos as a whole, independent of anything about mixture. And so he says here that Chrysippus gets the cause of unity, of the unity of substance, wrong. And he says the right way to think about this would be it's the nature of God and the encircling ethereal body producing the seasonally ordered changes that hold together and preserve the all. So he takes this idea of the unification of substance as an independent problem that the peripatetics can give a better account of. And then he says, the Stoic account is just wrong, and also it runs into the problem that body can't pass through body, right? And one of the things that I think is interesting is if you read down in this passage in chapter 10, you'll see that Alexander is targeting sympathy as the explanandum, or is targeting the same explananda that sympathy in the Chryssippian account is supposed to address. So he's showing us how sympathy is an outcome of the unity produced by pneuma pervading matter, not just at the cosmic level, but actually at the level of the unity of all unified bodies. So he goes on to say, not just that the peripatetics can give a better account of the unification of all substance, he actually goes on to say, and we can also give an account of the unification of individual unified bodies, that would be form, and we can give an account for the sympathy between bodies. So you can see how the language of sympathy comes back in. He reintroduces the idea of this encircling divine ether to give an account of that. And he also says, and this is, presumably, I think, a peripatetic innovation in response to the Stoic identification of sympathy. He says, well, we can account for the sympathy between bodies because of their participation, the koinonia of hule, so that they all participate in matter as a community. So we can see here that apart from mixture, how you unify substance and how you unify individual bodies is a problem independent of mixture, for which body pervading body with the results of sympathy is an outcome. And the very last piece of evidence to support this is T4, a couple chapters later, where Alexander is sort of summing up this discussion. And he again says, it's the doctrine of body pervading body, or passing through body, that is at the heart of pretty much all the important Stoic philosophical doctrines. And then he goes on to say that means the theory of mixture depends on this, so it's subordinate to this claim, but also so do all the things they say about soul and the much discussed fate and the providence of all things take their confirmation from it. Still further, the theory of the principles and God and the unification of the all in its sympathy with itself. For all of these things for them are God passing through matter. So the big category is God passing through matter, and here are all the things that result from it. Mixture is one of them, but the unification of the cosmos and its sympathy with itself. So you can see how that's treated as one single thing, unity and sympathy, as an outcome of positing body passing through body. Okay, so T3 with T4, T4 would suggest, to just sum this up, that body passing through a body takes priority. When we take T3 and T4 together, it suggests that a unifying substance with a corporeal cause of unity was the primary goal of the Stoics were attempting to come up with. And then we can see that at least with Chrysippus, and I think this is good evidence that Chrysippus invented a theory of sympatheia, that the sympathy of the parts of that unified body is a key consequence of the unification of matter by pneuma or other unified bodies, okay? Now, this sympathy won't have the problem that antipatheia would have if we're thinking about mixture at the level, or thinking about the relation, I want to say, between the active and the passive principle. So it goes in a different direction. So the cosmos can act and be acted on in a self-reflexive relationship. That's not a problem. So that seems what is really what we're looking at, not active and passive principles acting on one another, but in fact, this idea where the cosmos acts in relationship to itself and its parts are acted on in relation to each other, in relationship to the whole. Now, I'll just say this idea that the cosmos acts and is acted upon by itself is already put forth in the Timaeus when we're given an account of the constitution of the cosmic body by Timaeus. And I put that passage, this is just on the handout, it's not actually in the paper, but where he's giving an account of how the life of the cosmos unfolds when in fact it's a complete body.
So it's nothing is going in and nothing is coming out. Its waste serves as its own nutrition, its nourishment, and it acts on and is acted on by itself. So Plato doesn't use the language of sympathy here. When we get to Plotinus will, in Aeneid 4:4, introduce the question of how what it means for the cosmos to act and be acted on by itself. And in order to solve that question, he's going to go back to the claim that Plato makes in the Timaeus that the cosmos is a living animal. And he's going to say, we're going to be able to account for its acting on and being acted on by itself because this one cosmos is entirely sympathetic and it is one like a living being. So the claim would be that when Chrysippus introduces sympathy, he's responding to this question already broached in the Timaeus, and he's introducing the language of sympathy to talk about it. Okay, so that's sort of where we can start to see how sympathy emerges as an important site for thinking about something like differentiated relatives at the level of ontological holism, and also relate it to what some of the stakes might have been for a cosmozoologist working in the wake of the Timaeus. And maybe I'll just add here, I think part of what this shows the Stoics doing is taking really seriously the idea that if you make the cosmos an animal, its being an animal or a living thing is going to be the primary cause of its unification of itself, or somehow its sympathy with itself is going to manifest its living unity. We can get more into that. Okay. So I want to get in now to some of the evidence for sympathy. I'm not going to go into all of it. We could certainly go on for a long time about this, but I want to make one point, which is just the evidence to see how sympatheia emerges as a sign of the kind of unity constituted by the pervasion of pneuma through substance. The earliest evidence that I know of for the language of sympatheia is the verb sympaschein. This is T5, and it shows up in a passage attributed by Nemesius in Cleanthes. And the argument here is that no incorporeal sympathizes with a body and no body with an incorporeal, but one body sympathizes with another body. Now the soul, second premise, now the soul sympathizes with the body when it is sick and being cut, and the body with the soul. Thus, when the soul feels shame and fear, the body turns red and pale respectively. Therefore, the soul is a body. So you can see the language of sympaschein is playing a really key role in the argument. It's connecting premise 1 and premise 2 so that Cleanthes can draw the conclusion that soul is a body. Some of the context to this, so I don't want to get too much into the details for reasons of time. The language of sympathy first starts to appear in the 4th century. There are 2 instances in Plato, in the Republic, and the Charmides. Those both contain something like contagious affect between people. So that's already from the beginning one of the ways you can think about it. But in Aristotle and in Theophrastus, you're also going to start to see some language of sympathy to talk about the relation both between parts of the body, but importantly for our purposes, between body and soul. Now, there's one instance where Aristotle will use the language of sympaschein to talk about the relation between body and soul. That's T6 on the handout, and this is from the end of the Prior Analytics, where Aristotle is getting into the justification for physiognomy. And he says, where if a particular affection applies to any individual class, courage to the lion, it's necessary there be some sign of it. For it has been assumed that body and soul are affected together, sympaschein. Now, this is interesting because Aristotle had, before this passage, had laid out that soul and body share something in common. I should look the passage. It doesn't use the language of sympathy. That is a statement of the general claim that Aristotle's making in the Deonema, that soul and body have a range of koina pathe, common affects. But this is the only time he uses the language of sympathy. And one reason we might hypothesize he doesn't use it, which I've argued elsewhere, is that it would actually seem to commit him to the view that in a relationship of sympathizing, soul is acted upon by body and body is acted on by soul, which is precisely the problem that we saw in Alexander with the language of antipaskein, that we don't want that as a relationship between active and passive. We probably don't want a relation of sympathy between body and soul for Aristotle. Why would he use the language of sympatheia here? Okay, either he doesn't see the problem and he just happens to throw it out, or it could be that this language is starting to surface as technical language in physiognomic treatises. Some of the other 2 instances, which are the citations are in the paper itself. 2 other early instances of sympathy between body and soul are in the pseudo-Aristotelian physiognomy. And what's interesting about them, if you know this text, it seems to have two separate prologues so that it looks like two treatises on physiognomy were merged together in the transmission of the manuscript. And each of the prefaces uses the language of sympathy to talk about a foundational premise of why you can do physiognomy, because body and soul share affects. But in one case, it looks like causal interaction. And in the other case, you seem to have a desire to hold that off. So the argument is that you would never have a case where the affect of one, soul or body, extends beyond the affect to the other, because that would violate the hylomorphic principle that, in fact, we're just looking at two sides of the same affect. So already in the physiognomy, I think you can see some registering of the problem around the language of sympathy for Aristotle's theory of soul as unaffected. Whether Aristotle himself is aware of that or not, and we can't say. One other little point I can't resist making, Alexander will go on later in the Mantissa, which I think probably is by Alexander, to explicitly say, when we say body and soul sympathize, we don't mean like friends sympathize, we mean, he restates the claim of Aristotle, the hulomorphic account of emotion, but he shows that there's a real problem if the language of sympathy. Now, Alexander is writing after Cleanthes. Cleanthes, we can now see, exploits the corporealist implications of the language of sympathy in order to drive home the critique against Aristotle that indeed soul is body. And we can see that it's bodily by the fact that it's acted on by the body. Why I've gone into some of this background is that I think it can help us understand if we want to understand the strategy I think that Cleanthes is engaged in. What he's doing is he's taking a set of affects, for example, the soul feeling the pain of the body, or the body registering the motions of the soul as common to body and soul. And we think these they look like they're codified as signs of things common to body and soul. They may have been called sympathy already, but he's using that as evidence of sympathy that proves the premise that soul and body sympathize, and that below the surface, right, that bodies are acting on bodies. So I think you have to see this larger context to understand where the strategic intervention of the language of sympathy is coming in Cleanthes. Okay, what the point that I want to make is that Cleanthes goes in to use the language of sympathy to make a corporealist move against Aristotle, but all that it does is say soul is a body. It doesn't say soul is a particular kind of body, and it certainly doesn't address the problem that Aristotle lays out in the first book of the De Anima, which I put as a little bit there on 5, which is how do body and soul make a community? How do body and soul act and are acted on one another in such a way that they constitute what Aristotle calls a koinonia? And this is the larger question that I think sympathy is going to be introduced as a solution to once you get to Chrysippus. Okay, so the argument, and I'm making it really briefly here, would be to say, first, sympathy is used to say soul is a body like any other body, bodies act on each other. It's going to start to be used to be evidence that soul and body or any living thing constitutes itself as a unity, and the sympathy shows that these two things are in partnership. Okay. So where do we see this evidence? There are implications to the claim that sympathy will be the sign of an underlying sympathy of a unified body. There are implications for this for both individual unified bodies as well as for the cosmos as a whole. We can see that as I showed in T3b, where Alexander feels like he has to give peripatetic accounts of both the unity of individual bodies and the unity of the cosmos. We can also see it in the evidence for the Stoics themselves. So we've seen some of the evidence that sympathy manifests the unity of the cosmos produced by pneuma pervading matter in T3, 3b, and T4. All of those are cases where being sympathetic with itself looks like an outcome of the kind of unity created by pneuma. There's there's more evidence than I put on here, but I'll just give you one more passage, which is your T7. This is from Cicero in the De Natura Deorum. So this is Balbus, who's the Stoic mouthpiece. And this argument at 219 comes at the end of a suite of arguments that begins at 216 that are attributed to Chrysippus before Balbus will pivot and start talking about Zeno's syllogisms, and so reintroduce the question of the divinity of the cosmos, which is pretty good evidence that this is a Chrysipian argument. And so the claim here now, again, he would not be compelled to assent to the things I've said by such a sympathetic consentiens is a common Latin translation of sympathy, continuous natural affinity of things joined together in its breathing. Would it be possible for the earth to bloom at the single time and then in turn turns bare and stark, or for the sun's approaches and retreats at the summer and winter solstices to be known by the spontaneous transformation of so many things, or for the sea tides and the narrow straits to ebb and flow with the rising and setting of the moon, or for the different courses of the stars to be maintained by a single revolution of the whole sky? These things couldn't happen in this way were with all the parts of the world harmonizing together if they were not held together by a single divine and all-pervading breath. So what does this evidence show us? In the material from Alexander, we see being sympathetic with itself is a necessary consequence, Chrysippus asserted, to pneuma pervading matter. What this does is say there is evidence of sympathy in the world. This means we must assume there is some principle of unity producing this sympathetic effect. And then Balbus sort of jumps really quickly and says that must be a single all-pervading divine principle. But it's not a fully worked out argument. It's appealing to the phenomenal evidence now of something that's called sympathy, the same way that in the Cleanthes argument, he calls certain affects sympathy to argue that this is a sign of an underlying sympathy between the parts and the whole. And then he says, you must accept that this has a cause, this causes pneuma. There's a more worked out version of what the argument that the Stoics might have produced from sympathy for the unity of the cosmos in Sextus Empiricus. And this argument, I think, shows you maybe more clearly how appeals to phenomenal evidence of sympathy were systematically used to prove the unity of the cosmos as the complement to the argument the cosmos is unified, therefore it's sympathetic with itself. So this argument is T8, and it's a long passage. The first part, though, will be familiar, I think, to most people, or if not everybody here, where you get the Stoic taxonomy of different kinds of bodies. So you have the bodies that are conjoined and some are separate. And then we have the account of the henomena somata, which are the bodies controlled by a single hexus, such as plants and animals. Now we get the argument, seeing then that the cosmos is also a body, or we get the problem, the cosmos is also a body, it is either unified or conjoined or of separate parts. So what are the relationship between the parts and the body of the cosmos? And we're going to get an argument that it is a unified body. What is the argument going to be? So the first premise here is that, let's see, it is going, the proof is going to be, we're going to show that it's a unified body by the sympathies that it exhibits. Now, why would the sympathies that it exhibits show that it's a unified body? We need a separate argument for that, which Sextus actually reports. So in the case of bodies, this is the third paragraph, that are formed from conjoined or separate elements, the parts do not sympathize with each other, right? So this is underlined here at the bottom. So they don't, the parts don't sympathize. Sympasce tamere allelois. So since if all the soldiers, say, in an army have perished except for the one who survives is not seen to suffer at all through transmission, kata diadosin. This is language actually that's going to recur in Plotinus to talk about when his critique actually of a Stoic theory of sympathy. But in the case of unified bodies, there exists a certain sympathy. How are we going to prove this premise? Because when the finger is cut, the whole body shares in its condition, right? So what do we see in this argument? And so then the cosmos is also a unified body because it exhibits sympathies. Okay. So what I think this passage shows is how the sympathy of the parts manifests the relation between them through which they're constituted as parts of a unified body for the Stoics. Notice that what the evidence from Sextus allows us to see is a difference between relativity constituted as being a part relatively disposed to the whole and only being constituted by that relation. So in the case of the soldier, we could argue that the soldier is only constituted as a soldier relative to an army. let's just take that for the sake of argument. And so if the soldier is constituted in that way, then the destruction of the army would mean the end of the soldier. But here what we're looking at is a different kind of relation. Here the argument is that the soldier is a part of the army as a whole. The army as a whole is destroyed, but the soldier remains unaffected because the soldier and the other soldiers in the army are not parts of a unified body. So in this case, there's no relation between the part and the whole because we're not dealing with the relatively disposed, we're dealing with things that I would argue are something like differentiated relatives. So there seems to be a different case of the relation between part and whole that depends specifically on the capacity of the parts to act on and be acted on in relationship to the whole. And so in the unified body, it will be the case that the affect of a part, say the finger, I did actually cut my finger, that was hurting my whole body yesterday. So I proved the premise of the Stoic argument that unified bodies exhibit sympathy. And so in the case of the unified body, the affect of the part is necessarily going to be experienced by all of the other parts and the whole. Just a couple notes. I'm going to wrap up. And so so just a couple of things that I'm going to point out. Notice here that the evidence that the whole animal shares in the condition of the cut finger, of the smallest part, is uncontested. It was actually contested. If you look at Nemesius, he'll dispute the claim, in fact, that the pain of the part is felt by the whole, so that this becomes something that's targeted by some of the Stoics' critics. But where do the Stoics get it? They probably get it from Book 5 of the Republic, so 462 CD, which is where Socrates has been asked, you may remember from Book 5 of the Republic, to give an account of the sharing of women and children in the kind of eugenic constitution of the citizen body. And he introduces a proof to show how we'll know that this eugenic manufacture of kinship in place of natal kinship has been successful. And he says, if it's been successful, then all of the members of the citizen body will feel the pains and pleasures of one another in the same way that the finger will experience, that the whole ensouled animal will experience the pain of the finger. So that looks like a very early case where, first of all, you can see how organic unity is put forth as a paradigm of unity, but you also get the claim that in an organic or an ensouled body, I should say, not an organic body, an ensouled body for Plato, you will have the sympathy between all of the parts and the whole. The Stoics are building on that to make a claim not about the city or the citizen body, but they're now making a claim based on this argument about the finger, about the cosmos itself as a unified whole, as a unified community. And that's what we see in the argument from Sextus. Another point that I just want to make that I think is interesting, notice how what's also not contested is that an ensouled animal is a unity. So the fact that I feel the sympathy that I feel the pain of my finger shows that unified bodies exhibit a certain sympathy. There's no argument here that an ensouled animal is itself a unity. That's just taken for granted. And so I think there's a very particular role being played here by ensouled animals as models of complex unity that is being exploited by the Stoics here. But the notice that once you've elevated the ensouled animal as the paradigm of unity, you're going to then use the sympathy exhibited by that animal to argue for the unity of all unified bodies. And so here you would have stones exhibit sympathy, but of course the most important point is that the cosmos exhibits sympathy. In fact, here, Sextus suggests that the sympathy exhibited the cosmos won't actually show everything you need about the kind of unity that the cosmos has. We'll say the only unity it shows is that it's unified by nature, because it's a dynamic, sympathy is dynamic here. We can get into this, but it doesn't go all the way. So the point is that in fact, sympathy doesn't have the capacity to show anything other than a body is unified. Okay, so just to sum up the point that I'm trying to make, it looks then like if we go to sympathy, sympathy becomes the kind of sign or condition that we can see that tells us that the parts of any unified body will behave like differentiated relatives in the sense that they're constituted through their capacity to act on one another and in relationship to the whole. Okay, very quickly, I'm going to make one last point. So just to sum up, the two kinds of relativity then that were laid out in relationship to the evidence from Simplicius, differentiated relatives and things relatively disposed, I would argue also have expressions at the level of the cosmos. And we can also see expressions of those forms of relativity that shed light on the part-whole relationship that constitutes the relation between things in the cosmos. So that's where we really need sympathy, because it gets us to a part-whole relationship analogous to the part-whole relationship in the question of parts that are relatively disposed. Now, I think the point that I want to make in closing is that we can see some of the consequences of this idea of being relatively disposed laid out for physics, because Chrysippus is quoted now by Plutarch on the point that because the parts are relatively disposed to the whole, they will have a natural motion, both by virtue of being bodies in their own right, but also insofar as their motion is determined relative to the good of the whole. Notice that the whole, the cosmos, does not cause the motion of the bodies in it by acting on them. Rather, their motion is given to them insofar as they are parts. So that's T9. So the cosmos has motion towards the center by virtue of its moving towards itself, and its parts insofar as they are parts. So that's the cashing out of the condition of being relatively disposed. By contrast, we have a situation where there's a relativity between the cosmos and its parts in the cosmos that is sympathetic with itself. And here the capacity to act and be acted on is crucial. The parts constituted as parts of the unified body through their capacity to act relative to each other and to the whole. So what my suggestion is that in the first case, we can see a way of thinking about the relation between parts and the cosmos as a whole that's metaphysical and mereological. And in the second case, we can see a relationship between parts and a whole that is in the realm of physics, where parts are acting on one another in relationship to the whole. And then my last suggestion is that perhaps we can see the first case in terms of a definition of the cosmos as a whole. And the second case is a definition of the cosmos as a unity. And the idea that you would distinguish between a whole and a unity is suggested in T10, the evidence from Chalcidius, where he says, and so the universal body, according to the Stoics, is limited in one, unum, and whole in substance. It's whole because it does not lack any parts. It is one because its parts are inseparable and mutually coherent with themselves. So that suggests that the parts acting, mutually cohering with themselves is a condition of it being unified. In the first case, it looks like wholeness is determined by the fact that a whole lacks nothing. It lacks no part, but it also is in itself. And that goes back to that distinction between prostia and kathauta that we were looking at earlier. It also has no relation to anything outside of it. So it's not self-sufficient is often predicated then of things that are also wholes, but like a whole is determined by lacking nothing, being in itself. A unity is determined by the parts all being coherent and inseparable. So that seems to support the idea that a whole and a one are two ways of talking about the cosmos that correspond to these two ways of thinking about the relation. So the last, I'll just sum up, both the wholeness and the unity of the cosmos are important to the Stoics in their cosmology and in their ontological holism. But I would argue they offer different angles on ways of thinking about the nature of the cosmos in relationship to its parts. And my best working hypothesis is one is in terms of metaphysics and the other is in terms of physics. Thank you.
Preguntas, comentarios, cuestiones. Vanessa?
Okay, so tell me if this is right. I'm looking at this argument on page 2, this is number 6 on the handout. So this account of Sympatheia is offered as an alternative to thinking of the archive as interacting.
Right.
Okay. And so,
Well, yeah, I mean, it would be to say we could deny interaction as the way the relation between the archive is constituted. But interaction is crucial to the way the parts are in relation to each other and to the whole. So there's two, yeah.
okay, so one problem is that I don't understand the Constitution thing in this context. But maybe leaving that to the side, I guess my question was going to be something like, well, what are the mechanics of this Sympatheia, if not some sort of interaction? And I was wondering also, is would it be right to say something like that what you're doing is taking the husking out of the Sympatheia?
So the idea would be that if
Interaction is denied to the relation between the active principles, they are only understood in terms of one's capacity to act and the other's capacity to be acted upon, right? Right. But once you have the pervasion of God through matter, you have the unification of substance, and that's the cosmos. And of this unity now, we can predicate sympathetic with itself. And how does that work? And I do in the paper start to say, okay, if you wanted a full account of this, I would have to explain not just how parts act on one another, but how the cosmos acts on itself in a self-reflexive relationship. So one way of starting to go down that route is to look at how the Stoics are responding to this question of self-reflexive action as an expression of the self-sufficiency of the cosmos on the one hand, but the fact that it's a living being on the other hand, it exists in time and has a life, that's already given in the Timaeus. And so this idea of self-reflexive action is already given by Plato. How does it work out in the Stoics? I think you could start to think about it in different ways. So we know, I didn't put this passage on there, I'll send it to you, where we're told that the cosmos is self-sufficient because it nourishes itself through the changes between the parts. So the interaction of parts acting on one another is what constitutes the cosmos's own sustaining of its life. So that's it acting and being acted on in some sense.
So there is undergoing in that? That's what I was wondering, because it's like, if it's, so what is this reflexive acting if it doesn't involve some kind of undergoing?
for the cosmos.
Or for anything.
So again, I think you want to separate the archai are not under, the God is not undergoing anything. That seems right. Well, the cosmos is undergoing something. So one way to think about that would be to say, I just gave you an example of how the cosmos is acted on by itself as its parts in its body. It's nourished by its own waste, right? Another way to think about it, which I found really helpful, the paper that George Boyce Stones did for the volume that Ricardo did in 2021, where he gives, I think, a really compelling empiricist account of how, like, what are God's thoughts? And so he gives this explanation where pronoia is the way in which the hegemonicon of the cosmos after the cosmogony, right? So maybe I should pause here to say, in the cosmogony, God and substance, everything is here. And once you have the cosmogony, they separate out, and the hegemonicon is only in a part of the cosmos, which already is giving you enough of a differentiation, right, for that self-reflexive relationship to work. His argument is that through providence, it's like there's a constant relationship of self-perception happening, which is very much like the account that Heracles gives of animal self-perception in the Elements of Ethics, and that this is governing how the cosmos lives its life through a form of kind of providence, so that would help explain why you need specifically animal unity
in order to give an account of the cosmos living its own life, because it has to be engaged in this self-perception. Now, it's not just any animal, it's a perfectly rational animal, such that it will constantly be reading its own nature, so to speak, its own seed, and producing that, fulfilling it as the best possible life. One thing that's interesting here is, like in Plotinus, you have a very different kind of sense, right? Where nature sort of unfolds through sympathy at the lowest level of the world soul with no pronoia. And then you have intellect, and he sort of eliminates that middle layer, which is partly why he denies that the world perceives itself and is perceived by itself. I think the Stoics actually do think that the world is constantly perceiving and being perceived by itself, feeding and being fed by itself, realizing its life. So that would be the way I would go when you start to think about and we could keep going down this route. But I think there's a lot of evidence that suggests this corresponds to the way the Stoics thought about how the cosmos lives its life.
I mean, I definitely think the Hierocles is relevant, but I also think that Hierocles is giving you a highly mechanical action and passion situations. I think we're probably just going to read these things all very differently.
Well, what do you mean by mechanical?
Well, I think the blending of the soul and the body in Hierocles is quite literally a pushing back and forth, so that you really do have both action and passion.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems like maybe the move to perception is a way to sort of minimize the physicality of it.
No. I actually think not at all. I think that the
Pushing back and forth is going to happen anyways, right?
We're denying. I guess I don't understand it, because it seems like we're trying to deny that there's undergoing.
No, we're not. What?
By the active principle. But maybe that's so. I
see. You think that Hierocles shows us that the active principle must undergo?
No, I don't think that's what the Hierocles shows. I do think we should ask ourselves why we need to deny that the active principle undergoes. I mean, I know why Alexander thinks so, but I don't know that we should follow him on that. So I guess my last thought would just be, what if we didn't accept premise C? What if the whole governing thing here was not to find an alternative to A, but actually to reject C?
So I think
At some level, I mean, I would agree. I would say the active principle being defined as an active principle would exclude it being acted upon. So as a body.
But as a body, it is capable both of action and passion.
But we don't have to accept that.
No, but it's worth sort of supporting.
So we could, but it actually, I mean, I wouldn't accept that, which is why I would say the problem of action and interaction as a way of thinking about relativity isn't worked out between the active and passive principle at all. It's only worked out in terms of sympatheia, but it's actually not crucial to my argument to defend that there's no antipatheia between the active and the passive principle. That could be another way in which differentiated relatives are expressed at the level of the cosmos. But if we're looking to a counterpart to being relatively disposed, where we're really trying to think the relation of parts to wholes, then the sympathy relationship is going to be the cleanest counterpart to the relative disposition of parts to wholes in the domain of physics. And that's really the stronger claim that I would make. Now, I think the Hierocles, and this is what I was just working out, it is relevant. So I think that you need two conditions for sympathy. You need to have blending, and you have to have a unity. You have to be a unified body. That's the evidence that I was looking at. All unified bodies are mixtures, but not all mixtures are unified bodies. The Hella suggests that there is a form of sympathy even in mixtures that aren't unified bodies. But if you're using the evidence for Hierocles, I don't think that can follow, because Hierocles is only talking about the relationship between the soul and the body. That is not just a mixture. They are participating in a community that's unified, therefore they will exhibit sympathy. You can't extrapolate from that back to all mixtures. The only thing that Alexander says about the relation between the constituents in a mixture is that they're extended right through each other. So you get this idea of antiparektasis, right, which is not sympathy or antipathy for that matter. But if we could, I have this thought that maybe there's a way that the really neutral sense of sympathy that's mobilized by Cleanthes, where it means just bodies acting on bodies, saying nothing about a unity, just bodies acting on bodies. Maybe that is going on. Maybe we could allow that that's going on in a mixture that's not unified. But Chrysippus has clearly put a lot of weight on the language of sympatheia to only account for that interactive mechanical, like, yeah, there might be mechanical interaction, but it's only going to be sympathy when it is between the parts of a unified body. So that would be a way to account for your mechanical interaction in relation to this higher level of sympathy. But I think the language of the interaction is going to go towards the unified body.
Yes. Thank you so much. There's a lot to think about. I want to picture on how 5 and 6 worked on the handout. You can give an example of responding particularly to Aristotle. Maybe understand why you talk about that.
Yeah, I mean,
I think that he is, I mean, that's a little bit speculative. I mean, you could just say he's using this argument to show the corporeality of the body, completely indifferent to the arguments of Aristotle and Plato that soul is incorporeal. It seems more likely that he has Plato and Aristotle's arguments claims that soul is incorporeal in mind, that he's advancing this as an argument against them, right? So minimally, let's say, thinking that Plato and Aristotle's ideas about incorporeality of soul are a target when you make the argument for the corporeality of soul. And this is an argument that's actually shared by the Epicureans that you can see from Lucretius book 3. It's more attractive, I think, to also, like, it would look even better if Cleanthes is now exploiting the common affects, or the idea of an affect common to body and soul. And the first time you get that expression is in the Philebus, and then Aristotle blows it up, right? The koinopathe are everywhere when he thinks about the shared life of body and soul. It would be more attractive to think that Cleanthes is taking over that body of evidence that soul and body have these affects in common, and extrapolating from it that if you think that this is the sign that soul and body participate in community, the only way they could do that, given that we see sympathy, is that their bodies acting on one another.
Well, I think I'm with you, and I spent my thought with why not think Plato exclusively, I suppose was my first thought. You mentioned some pseudo-Aristotelian stuff. Is that right?
yeah. So sorry, we didn't put all the passages from the paper here, and so there's some more passages here in relation to the paper. So I mentioned the pseudo-Aristotelian physiognomy, which is the two prefaces there in chapter 1 and chapter 4 are early evidence of the use of sympathy between body and soul. And in both cases, they seem to be aware of the idea that this would mean interaction between body and soul. And each author, if you think they're different, adopts a different relation. One of them thinks, great, physiognomy must depend on causal interaction. And the other is like, ooh, we don't want to go there. They always are synchronous. So this shows that, they're still holomorphically acceptable.
Oh, I think that works. I mean, you remember Jack Mansfield's piece?
Yeah, the Dana, the 2002 piece.
Well, he speaks the soul and super soul and Heraclitus, and he makes a connection between.
Oh, I don't know that piece. Okay, I was thinking
more recent than that. But anyway, it's got a connection between the problemata in Cleanthes that I always thought was interesting.
Oh, yeah, no, I don't know that. I'd love to see that.
4th century, sort of late 4th century texts and Cleanthes. So
the problemata, which again, this would be a very long paper if I went into everything. So
Problemata are one of the clearest sites for the emergence of discoursive sympatheia that's peripatetic. But it's sympathy between different members of the same species, and you start to get the idea that what allows for sympathy is shared nature or oikeiosis. Those are some of the explanations. There's one instance of soul-body sympathy in the Problems. Yeah.
May I ask a question?
Yeah.
I wouldn't understand your argument. So, first of all, if we look at the passage from Sextus T8.
Mhm.
You know, what it seems to be saying there, two things that we discussed. One of them is that it seems to be saying that some parts of the cosmos may have an effect or maybe causally related to other parts of the cosmos. For example, he says, in accordance with the waxings and wanings of the moon, many sea and land animals will rise. Yeah. So there is part relation. No, and I think that what's interesting and peculiar in this kind of relation is that the moon has an effect on land animals, even though they are very far away from each other. No, it's not an action that occurred by contact. No, so the way in
Or by
which,
evident contact.
or by evident contact, no. So the way in which this is explained, I mean, how is this possible? So the answer is that this is possible thanks to the fact that the cosmos is unified. No? So that's one question I want to ask you. What is your evidence for saying that in all cases, sympathy is a partial relation? There are cases, and I would ask you please to remind me, where is this passage for the finger? No, there is a passage, I mean, which is what happened to you yesterday, but there is a passage which says that when you cut your finger, this affects the whole.
This is in the Sextus.
It is in Sextus.
Yeah. So since when the finger is cut, the whole body shares in its condition.
In T8.
Yeah.
At the end.
Yeah.
Okay, well, very well. So that's an example of a part-whole relation. Yes.
Yeah.
But the other one is not a case of part-whole. It's a case of part-part.
Yeah.
So would you agree with that? That
Yeah.
in some cases it's a part, in some cases a part-whole. So that's one question. And the other question is related to that, which is the following. And you seem to argue that sympathy is what gives unity.
No, I'm not arguing that.
Oh,
It's a condition that is both manifest through occurrences of sympathy.
Yes.
So
Yeah,
look,
exactly.
there are phenomenal occurrences of sympathizing that then become taken as evidence of an underlying condition
Right.
of sympathy
That's how I see
caused
it.
by pain.
Yes, that's how I see it. No, the unity of the cosmos is what explains the possibility of sympathy.
Exactly.
No, it's not that sympathy is itself what
Exactly. Yeah.
unifies, no?
Yeah.
So well, so we agree. And if you look at the argument in here in protection, the argument is that the cosmos is either unified, formed of things conjoined, or formed of things that are separate.
Right.
No? And he says, well, sympathy is impossible in things other than unified. Objects, bodies, no. Sympathy is not possible.
Or not possible. Not possible.
It's not possible in bodies that are not unified. So, given that there is sympathy, the cosmos is unified. So unity here is a necessary condition
Exactly.
for sympathy. No, it's not a sufficient one, or it's not what sympathy is. No, I mean, it's a necessary condition. Yeah,
Right.
so we're with that. So the other issue, and is would you agree as well that sympathy is sometimes a part relation and sometimes also a part relation?
Yeah, so this is good. I mean, this is something I've seen across the sources, and I guess what I would here, even in the T8, you can see both claims being made, and the parts in non-unified bodies don't sympathize with one another. So that's the idea, usum pasque mereology. So there's the parts. But the evidence that unified bodies unified bodies express sympathy is a part-whole relation, or it looks like a part-whole relation, right? Because the whole animal.
Yes.
So you can see how these two claims are mixed together even here. And I would argue, I think what connects them is to say the parts in a unified body can only sympathize because they are also in a relation to the whole.
Right.
So that it's the structure of the whole that governs the capacity for the parts to sympathize. And this goes back, I think, to what I was talking about Vanessa. Like you could call this sympathy, any agent-patient relationship, you could in theory call it sympathy. But here he seems to be reserving it for the kind of interaction between bodies that are constituted as parts of a unified whole, which allows for both the idea of sympathy between the parts manifesting the wholeness and the move from the part to the whole. So that the affect of the finger is felt by the whole animal.
Well, in that case, I agree that's the case. That the whole animal is affected by the cut in the finger. But not every causal relation or every interaction between bodies or every case of sympathy between parts also affects the whole.
Well, so this is a really interesting question. So, because one might also say that the whole is involved in the other way, that bodies only affect each other because they participate in the whole. So that would be to take an angle on the cut to the finger from the perspective of a bait. So in scenario one, we would say, I cut my finger and now the whole suffers. In scenario two, we would say, because my life is such that I'm destined to cut my finger, the parts are going, the finger is going to be cut, and then I'm going to suffer as a whole animal. And this relation, so there's a couple things going on, but one of the things that I can see in the book, and it's an argument I make in the book as a whole, is that sympathy is a very interesting condition because it, on the one hand, is what I call magnified vulnerability. Magnified vulnerability means if I'm a unified whole, every little part is going to be a portal to my vulnerability. The portal it will implicate the whole. And that's the first use of sympathy in Book 10 of the Republic. Sympathy is very bad. It's because I'm in the theater open to the affects of the performers, and it's these intensified conditions of spectatorship. And Socrates says, even someone whose soul is in order, under these conditions where the body and the mind is sort of, the senses really are porous and the affects are very intense, these affects will come in, right, and disorder the whole operation of the animal. And that's what I call, this idea of contagious affect. Sympathy is very bad, right? And then I think you have this thing where sympathy is then what I call reparative unity, where sympathy is a way of recuperating a living unity, not as a sign of being totally open to the world and porous and affected, where affective life is a very bad thing. Rather, and this is what you already see in book 5 of the Republic, the ensouled body whose whole feels the pain of the heart is the model of a paradigmatic unity. So it's not just a counter model. I think it recuperates the living being as the paradigm of unity. And that cuts across a lot of the evidence.
Yes, what I want to resist when I don't like the idea that every case of sympathy is a case of part-whole relation. What I want to resist is that if that were true, then you could move to the idea that when that any part, whatever it does, has an effect on all the parts as well.
Right.
So if I affected the cosmos as a whole when I do this, then you could say, well, if I affect the whole cosmos, then when I do this, then the sun is affected as well.
Yeah.
So But I don't.
I mean, the sun would be
I don't want to believe that the Stoics think that because it's so likely. But certainly is that some cases of sympathy are cases where one part affects another part which is far away.
Yeah.
And some different cases, in some cases, the part affects the whole, like when you cut your finger and the whole animal, the whole person, you know. But the question of unity, yes, of course. I mean, if the cosmos were not a unified whole, then maybe some parts couldn't affect other parts, just those which are next to them. But thanks to the fact that the whole is a unified, that explains how it is possible for two very distant parts to affect one another. But that doesn't mean that this affection actually takes place every time one part acts.
So,
Yeah.
I mean, I would resist the claim that a part can affect a part without affecting the whole. So when the Stoics are looking at, say, the influence of the moon on the sea and the tides, that is, they're appealing to phenomenal evidence to make the claim that there are sympathies that prove the unity of the cosmos. Why does the moon affect the tides? Well, not in some isolated relation between the moon and the tides, but because this is part of a general relation between the heavens and the earth, through which the heavens influence the earth, but then the earth is nourishing the heavens. The way these parts are sort of unfolding in their relation of sympathy is in relationship to the whole. One of the problems I would say rather that the Stoics have is to distinguish when that interrelation of parts counts as the expression of nature, when it's pronoia, and when it's fate. And you can see evidence of that in the divination. But the other thing is, you know, right before this passage in Plutarch, you get the argument that Plutarch, you know, about vice, right? And so he again, I mean, I could have given this passage where he's saying whatever happens to the parts happens to the whole. So therefore, if there's vice in the world must, you know, have vice. You know, so you can see how there's critiques around this claim that the Stoics are making and seem very committed to. But it does seem to be pretty integral to them that the parts are always affecting the whole, and that the whole is governing the parts. That's the whole idea of living homo luminos te fuse.
Okay. So just let me ask you one last question. How would you think? Would you make a difference between the two cases? I mean, let's suppose that the effect of the moon on the tide and the effect of the cut in the finger on the whole animal, that both are cases of part-whole relation. Fine. Now, is there a difference between the two cases? Or there is no difference at all, but it's exactly the same phenomenon? No, and I mean, you could, I mean, even, I mean, if you consider that it's a part-whole relation in both cases, you can still try to...
They're different aspects, right? So I think, you know, you can analyze sympathy in terms of the sharing of affect among the parts, and you can actually give an account of that in mechanistic terms. I mean, I could show you how, like, Gominas gives an account of sympathy, which is completely governed by mechanical conditions. How close are the bodies? How intense is the dunamis? This body, okay, yes, the moon affects the sea, but you can't, Sirius, the dog star can't affect, it's too far away. Those are purely mechanistic conditions for sympathy. Posidonius goes a step further clearly in giving his account, right? So that it has to be farther. So there are always different, sympathy always can resolve upwards. And so the part-whole relation is always in play, even when they're sometimes looking at part-part relations, usually to make arguments about the existence of sympathy in the whole. So that's the claim that I would make.
Okay. Good one. Anyone else? So we still have a few minutes. We may ask another question.
Yeah.
So what's the tension you see between the sympathy theory that I didn't get quite well. The sympathy theory and the theory of blending. I mean, why would a whole whose unity is explained by the blending of an active body on a passive body, why would that kind of unity go against looking at this whole as unified by sympathy, or there is no tension between?
So maybe, and I'm going to just maybe make one point about what your question about these different kinds of sympathy. Is there any difference, right? There is. And I think, if we had more time, we could go into, like, if you look at when he gives his elaboration of the Timaeus in terms of sympathy, he actually is sort of struggling with this question. He's talking about sympathies between the parts, and he's trying to understand why some things sympathize because there's a likeness, but then he also gives an account of sometimes they're, and then he's trying to think about how the whole animal is affected. So clearly this is like built into some of the difficulty in the theory and how you think about it. But so we could go into that. But wait, now I just forgot. I had an answer to your question. Remind me what your question was.
The question was whether there's a tension between unity by blending and
unity by blending, right? So here too, I think that it's a perspectival issue. So it seems clearer and clearer to me that whatever the relation between the parts of a blend is not going to be the same as the relation between parts of a blend that is also unified by a single hexis. And so if Chrysippus pulls sympathy to account for only in the latter case, he would use that, not just to distinguish between the interaction of elements of a mixture. But what's interesting is with that men-de clause, when we first get Chrysippus's theory of blending, is that the difference between mixtures that aren't unified and unified bodies are all occurring within a world in which these bodies are themselves parts of a unified whole. So by virtue of the fact that matter is thoroughly pervaded by pneuma, all bodies are participating in the cosmos' sympathy with itself. So at that level, sympathy is total. But then if we shift down and look at the idea of the constitution of, or the composition, maybe I shouldn't say, the composition of mixed bodies and unified bodies, then sympathy is only going to come into play with those bodies that are both blended and unified, right? So that it's a question, again, of perspective, where the Stoics' account of sympathy has two main points of contact: the unity of individual unified bodies and the unity of the cosmos. The unity of individual bodies that's constituted by sympathy, I don't know if I can say that, created by sympathy, is in some tension with the idea that they are also parts relatively disposed to the whole. So when I think about them as a unity made by sympathy, not made by unity, a unity in a condition of sympathy, I'm really thinking about them as wholes. But when I think about the whole world as unified by pneuma, I'm now a partial whole. So one of the things that I think is interesting is that you never are going to find language of sympathy to talk about the relation between bodies as bodies in the Stoics. You're only going to think about them in relation to as parts in a whole, or you're going to think about sympathy as the relation between the parts of me as a unified whole. So the discourse that we were mentioning in the physical, the problemata, that's a case where you're going to get a different kind of account that actually helps us get a sense of what Alexander is doing, where you have the problem. Why is it when I see someone being tortured on the rack, do I feel pain in my mind? And these are given examples of sympathy. And the two answers that are given is it because there's a physis that's koine to both of us, or is it because of oikeiotes? So this idea of common nature, I think, starts to develop in the Peripatetics, and it starts to get used more and more. Plutarch uses it to talk about how you and me as bodies, but not parts of the whole cosmos, but just as bodies, can sympathize. What is it we would need to share? It's not enough for us both to be bodies.
you need some other koinonia, some community we both participate in. And for the peripatetics, that may operate at the level of the species. So those examples of in the problemata are not just about humans, they're about contagious urination among pack animals.
Yes.
You then also get a discourse, I argue, the problems pulls this discourse in one way. In Hellenistic historiography, you're going to start to get an account of sympatheia between humans that works alongside pity, often framed as natural sympathy, where this starts to pull towards a theory of universal kinship. But the Stoics would never accept that. They would never say you and I are members of our cosmopolitan because I feel sympathy for you. They hate pity. The sage doesn't pity anybody. We're unified together in a community by reason. But in the historiographers, you start to see the idea that when you suffer, and you'll find examples in enemy, like the Romans will feel sympathy for a conquered enemy, sympatheia, natural sympathy. They are reunified by a common nature that manifests in the capacity for me to share affects with you. And you'll find examples of this in Theophrastus in his defense of why we should not be animals.
So is it okay if we finish? Thank you very much.
Thank you.